Well, good morning and welcome. I'm Bob Wiltenberg, Dean of University College. We're very glad to see you here for this fourth and final lecture in our series devoted to justice and race in urban environments in which we and increasingly all the world are living. May I also say that if you've enjoyed this series, we particularly invite you to join us for the matchless continuing stimulation of courses in the Master of Liberal Arts program, or to consider participating in our Lifelong Learning Institute. Information on these and all of our programs are available online at ucollege.worcester.edu, and indeed the tapes of each of these lectures will also be available there. Some already are. From the turnout this morning, I suspect that our speaker, Gerald Early, Merle Professor of Modern Letters and Director of the African and African Studies program, doesn't require much introduction for this audience. Nonetheless, I'll say a few words. Professor of Modern Letters, as a title, seems exactly right, suggesting both the older term, man of letters, of which he is such a sparkling example, essayist, poet, critic, editor, anthologist, commentator, writer of Grammy-nominated liner notes, inspirer of Ken Burns, and much, much more. But also modern, understanding that letters these days encompasses a lot more than just what's written in books. Films and TV and YouTube, music, sports, politics, high and low, dolls, toys, indeed anything and everything that shapes and influences our individual and collective experience. And in all of those, Gerald sees things that others miss and helps us all to find them. He's now embarked, among several projects, on editing Washington University's new interdisciplinary journal, The Common Reader. Before that, he spent a dozen years as the founding director of the Center for the Humanities and editor of its newsletter, for which he adopted the challenging motto, "One civilized reader is worth 1,000 boneheads." I always enjoyed seeing that motto. First, because it reminded me of the time when, as a baby dean, I heard a senior dean refer to a difficult colleague as a bonehead, pointing to her ears and explaining solid ivory from ear to ear. But also because the motto suggested that I could and should be, and if I read the newsletter, might become, less of a bonehead about some things than I had been. To observe closely and with a minimum of preconceptions what one really sees and feels, both in the present and regarding the past, to think things through with one's own mind and one's own heart, whatever others may be saying, with eloquence, humor, and passion to share what one finds with all the rest of us so that we too might think more clearly, feel more deeply, and perhaps even someday choose more wisely. That's the power of the truly civilized reader, of whom there is no better current example than our own Gerald Early. We're delighted and honored to have him here this morning speaking on the subject of night and the city, race, riots, and the rise and fall of urban America. Gerald?
Thank you, Bob. Thank you all so much for coming out this morning, especially on a Saturday, and I'm sure you have better. I'm flattered because I'm sure you can find something better to do on your Saturday than come out here. So I'm really flattered that you would take the time to come out here and hear what I have to say. I should start out by saying I am not an urban sociologist. I am not an urban historian. I just wanted to warn you about that. I don't have any answers for anything, because that's one of the things that usually with this kind of a talk, people come up to you afterwards and want to know what kind of answers you have for stuff. I don't have any answers. I know that may come as a disappointment to you, but I really don't have any answers. But on the other hand, I'm not charging anything. I'm not being paid for this. I'm not charging anything. And so think about it like this, that the people who have answers, when they want to come give talks, they want to charge you a lot of money for you to hear their answers. So this is what you might call truth in advertising. I'm telling you right up front, I don't have any answers, but I'm not charging you anything. So, therefore we will all get along, I think, very well. So, one of the things about the title of my talk, one of the reasons why I call it Night in the City is when I was a young man, when I was about 20 years old and living in Philadelphia, I worked for the municipal court system for about a year. And that job meant that I had to interview and write up an interview sheet for everyone who got arrested in the city of Philadelphia. It was a team of us who did this. And we worked 24 hours a day. And I had the worst shift. I worked from midnight to 8 in the morning. I had this graveyard shift. It was a team of us who had this shift. And when I first got the job, I was under the impression that, oh, this is going to be a really easy shift in the sense that, oh, there won't be anything to do and I'll be able to sleep most of the time. But what I learned is that most disorder happens at night, and most people are arrested at night. And so actually the busiest time was the time from midnight till 8 in the morning. That night was something different in the city than the day. And so it made me think about the city in a different sort of way, learning about this whole sort of subterranean and different culture that occurs at night. It made me think also about people when they first came to the city back in the early part of the 20th century. When people migrated to the city and the country became urbanized, it made me think that these people, the various types of people who came, including African Americans who came in large number, and most of these people were rural people. When they came to the city, one of the things that must have really struck them was how different the night is in the city. Because in the city, at night, there is so much more light than there is in the country where they came from. And that must have been really remarkable for people to see that for the first time. I suppose that might explain why the famous blues song has the line, "Bright lights, big city, has gone to my baby's head." That literally seeing the lights at night in the city transformed people. And so that's partly why I have the title, Night in the City. I have another reason for the title that I'll tell you about a little bit later on. So without any further ado, let's talk about a few things about the city and about race and about riots. So, race in the city. The first thing I'd like to talk to you about is I'm going to kind of march you through something, and I'm going to march you up to a certain moment. So this has a kind of narrative thread to it. So it's not random. I'm going to tell you a story, okay? So let's start out with the migration to the city of African Americans. I'm going to tell you a story about African Americans in this city. Okay? The Great Migration, this happened in the United States between 1915 and really 1960, when you got this huge population shift. And African Americans left the rural South to move to cities. They moved to southern cities, they moved to northern cities, and this was a huge transformation, not only for this population, but for the United States when this happened. And it happened in these states. The world wars were very important energizers for this happening, and this huge transformation that occurred. It changed the population of African Americans. It changed the dynamic and chemistry of populations in cities, and it changed cities. And it made cities something different as a result of this large number of African Americans who came to cities. Why did they leave the South, the rural South? In 1900, most African Americans worked in agriculture, and the vast overwhelming majority of African Americans lived in the South. Why did they come north? Okay. For the same kind of reasons most people decide they're going to migrate somewhere. One is because of economic opportunity. I can do something, there seems to be something better around the corner than there is where I am. There seemed to be something more being offered, particularly in the industrial north. There seemed to be better jobs. There's a possibility for making more money. And so there's economic opportunity that is attracting African Americans to come to cities, as it is for other people, to come to cities for economic opportunity. So there's this pull of economic opportunity, but there's also the push of racism. Racism in the South is very severe. We're talking about the turn of the century, and we're talking about basically two societies that exist. separate and very unequal. There is the world that black people live in the South, and there's the world that white people live in the South. And the world that white people live in the South is a world that's meant to subordinate, suppress, and control the world that black people live in. And this is a world that's a harsh world that black people live in. It's a world of very limited economic opportunity. It's a world that has limited social mobility. It's a world of intense restrictions. And it's a world where you get these spasms that come up every once in a while called lynchings and race riots. The kind of race riots I'm talking about that would occur would be riots where whites would attack blacks in their own communities and kill blacks in their own communities and lynch blacks in their own communities. Why did these sort of things happen? Well, there would be a particular local thing that would happen that would cause this sort of thing, any particular incident. But generally, these pogroms, which is really the word for them, these pogroms really happen as control mechanisms. It was meant to control this particular population. So this sort of thing, of course, after a while, people want to get out of this. And this was a driver to have black people move out of the southern rural areas and to leave the South and to move to the North, where they thought there would be less racism and they would be less subjected to the strictures of Jim Crow and segregation in the South. Cultural opportunities. Cities offer culture. I mean, if there's one thing that cities are culture-making machines. And going to the city offered African Americans enormous opportunities to develop themselves culturally. If they hadn't gone to cities, you wouldn't know about jazz. If they hadn't gone to cities, you wouldn't know about blues. You wouldn't know about these art forms because cities made these art forms possible. You wouldn't know. Black people went to cities and they decided to do all sorts of things to develop themselves culturally, to try to build institutions. What's a really interesting institution, I mean churches and schools and things like that, but was a really interesting institution that black people built very early on when they began to urbanize themselves in 1920. Black people decided they wanted to have professional baseball and created the Negro League. Now a baseball league, a sports league is a very complicated business structure to make. It takes a lot of capital to do it, and you're talking about a group of people who don't have very much capital, and they don't have really enough organizational power to really pull this thing off, but yet they thought they could. They thought, and it was because of coming to the city that made them think they could do it. The city offered them the audience. They felt they had the audience to do it. They felt that they could have the venues to do it. They felt that they could even have the labor to do it. That there was enough going on for black people in the cities to develop ball players. I mean, you have to have a labor pool to have a league. And they felt they could develop and maintain a labor pool. It's an amazing story. I mean, it's just, the Negro League to me is one of the most amazing American stories. I mean, yes, the leagues didn't wind up succeeding as businesses, but they sustained themselves for a very long time, even though the owners lost money. I mean, the owners lost money almost every year they had the leagues. I mean, the leagues collapsed and they came back up again. It's an amazing story. And it happened because of cities. The teams were built around cities. It would not have been possible to do this without African Americans becoming urbanized. And political opportunities. To go north, to leave the South, meant you could vote. That makes a big difference. This made a big difference in the development of African Americans in the United States, the fact that they could vote. If you live in Greenwood, Mississippi, you can't vote. But if you go to Chicago, you can vote. That's huge. That's going to wind up being very huge for African Americans. It's going to wind up being very huge for the United States that African Americans, in making this population shift, empower themselves as a political pressure group. And it makes it possible for them to have politics. And that is going to wind up being very significant in our tale. Going to the city was it wasn't like going to heaven. I mean, some people thought it would be. I mean, kind of like going to heaven, but it wasn't really like going to heaven. It was going to another place. And so all of a sudden, when African Americans made the shift, it became an urban population in the 20th century as this process was going on. They ran into, of course, issues and problems in going into the city. There was the issue of crime and police brutality. African American neighborhoods suffered from crime. You're talking about a lot of lower class people living in an area, and crime is going to become a problem in that area, and they're going to have interactions with the police. The police, many of them in most of these big cities, are white police officers. They have very little respect or understanding for the African American populations that are coming into the city. In fact, they feel threatened or annoyed as these populations keep growing. And they too feel as though they need to in some way confine or control the growth of these populations. And so you get problems with police brutality. Plus, as all of you know, the police, back in the day, the police were kind of rugged. I mean, the police were kind of rough. I mean, the third degree, I mean, you kind of think everybody knows kind of what that is. And so cops were, there are a lot of things that cops did then they don't do now, but it could be a harsh profession insofar as how the police often treated people they had to deal with. So there was this issue of crime and police brutality in these communities. The communities needed, it's a story that has continued up until this very day. These communities need and want policing, but they don't feel they get the kind of policing they need to help them. And so this is an old story. It goes back to the origin of African Americans in cities. Segregated schooling and inadequate education. As African Americans came to the cities, something happened in cities. What happened was that you began to get segregated neighborhoods, and as you got segregated neighborhoods, you got segregated schooling. And the schooling became uneven, and it became that African Americans had inadequate schooling. They complained constantly about schooling. African Americans, throughout their history as an urban population, constantly complained that the schooling that they had was inadequate compared to the schooling that whites had. So they wound up coming to the city in the hopes that they were going to get better schooling, and certainly the schooling in many instances was better than what they had in the South. But it still was not the equal of what whites had in the city when the northern cities began segregating their populations. And they began to segregate the populations as more black people came to the city and neighborhoods, and you got neighborhood segregation. Because what would happen is that African Americans would come into a neighborhood and whites would flee. That's an old story. And that's the story that starts with the urbanization of African Americans, was that whites left neighborhoods as African Americans moved in. So neighborhoods became all ethnic, all African American, almost invariably. And this was done, and you had real estate agents and so forth who actually did this on purpose. I mean, who actually their intention was to bust a neighborhood. They were called blockbusters, and their intention was to bring blacks into a neighborhood, to drive up, to make people sell their homes, and to as a result, make money as a result of people selling their homes by saying that black people were coming into the neighborhood. But this created a pattern of residential segregation that is with us to this day. And it has been a problem to try to deal with the issue of residential. It has been a huge problem to deal with the issue of to break down residential segregation. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And then there's unemployment and underemployment. African Americans were, because their education was restricted and because of the segregation, were restricted in the kind of job opportunities they had. And so you would get these protests and boycotts that started happening in cities in the 1930s. And these protests and boycotts would be things like, don't shop where you can't work. And they were attacks, and they were organized attacks against, attack is the wrong word, organized protest against shop owners and businesses that would not hire black employees, but would take black people's money as consumers. So you got an organized movement to try to deal with this and to try to open up employment opportunities for African Americans. And so this was also a real movement among African Americans for a very long time, is to try to deal with the problem of employment or underemployment and unemployment in cities. So these four major problems might sound very familiar to you, and they ought to, because they remain the problems today for urban black people. These problems remain about the same. They aren't quite being expressed in quite the same way, but they're the same but they remain the same problem. I'll talk about that a little bit more as we go along. Okay. Any questions so far? I always ask that in the class because people are silent, and and they look kind of puzzled. That gets me scared when people looking puzzled, and like I said, wow, Then I guess those guys wonder, am I speaking English? Because I'm looking at me like maybe I'm talking some other language, and I'm not speaking. So everything is cool so far. We all cool? We all know what's going on, sir. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. Oh, well, I don't really think I'm really injecting too much of my own life into this. That's a question that's a little difficult for me to answer. I'd like to hold off on trying to answer that question right now and maybe take it up after I finish this presentation, because I think I might be better equipped to answer it then when I'm finished. Okay, so we all cool? We all cool, okay, because my students say that too, and then, they just saying that because they just saying, is it going to be on the test? And then if it's going to be on the test, then, well, maybe you better go over it again, but, so let's talk about the city. African Americans have moved to the city. I'm telling you a story about African Americans moving to the city, how it has, the problems they encounter moving to the city. Because remember, they're generally undereducated and underskilled population that's moving to the city. It's basically a lot of poor working people are moving to the city. They would be called a peasant. They were like a peasant population, almost transforming itself into a proletariat moving to the city. So they face all these kind of problems. They're also a stigmatized group. And so they face enormous kind of problems moving to the city. So, of course, like other people, they think, I'm going to the city. It's going to solve certain kind of problems. And, certain things get solved, but you get a whole bunch of other new problems that you hadn't even anticipated. So, but what is the city? Okay, we talked about African Americans. Well, what is the city? So think about the dynamics, or what I call the logic of a city. There are three things that really cities are concerned with or focused on. One is population growth and then the expansion of cities. I mean, cities are all about how they expand and how they grow and how they deal with their population growth. That's the story of African Americans coming to the city. It was a form of population growth. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with this population of people coming to the city, and where do you put them? How are you going to handle it? How are they going to blend in or not blend in, or however it's going to work with their coming to the city? So cities are very much geared to having to deal with how their populations grow and spread and what that means. Second, transportation. Cities, it's extremely important in a city that you get around, that you have some way of getting around. That city is commerce, it's identity, it's what it's about. It's about how you get around in a city. And how you get around has a lot to do with what you can do in the city. It has a lot to do with how you can be employed in a city. If you have certain kind of transportation, you can have certain kinds of ways of being able to be employed. If you don't, you have limits to how you can be employed. It's very important for any kind of city planner that's thinking about cities. So much energy and time is spent on thinking about how we can move people around a city. That's extremely important. Movement in a city. Finally, the generation and distribution of wealth. How is wealth divided up in cities? How are African Americans able to generate money for themselves in the city? And how are they able to spend it? This is an issue with other people. This is an issue with every group of people in the city. So for me, the logic of the city, or how this works, are these three major points which I think are very important in understanding city life, and what cities are. The major things that cities are very concerned about insofar as their futures, what they're planning, how cities see themselves as cities. Okay? So, African Americans in the city after World War II. So we come into the heart of our story now. The city has developed. The city is doing the kinds of things that it needs to do in order to maintain itself, in order to maintain itself economically, in order to maintain itself culturally. And African Americans have now come into this mix of what the American city is about. The American city is about to, after World War II, reach a kind of apogee. I mean, it's about to reach a kind of high point in its development. And at this time, when the American city is about to reach this kind of high point in its development, is when it's beginning to get this big influx of black people. So this is an interesting kind of crossroads, or interesting kind of intersection in American history that's happening right now. That the American city after World War II is become a major force in American life. Urbanization has become the major force in American life. Okay, so African Americans after World War II. Because they're able to vote, and because there are enough of them in cities now, you now have the rise of protest politics. This is the beginning of protest politics. Okay, African Americans can now understand, as A. Philip Randolph told them, the African American labor leader, that if you want something, this is what the world is about, is power. If you want something, you have to be able to be at the table of power. You have to be able to be, the world is very simple. The world is very simple. You can either eat a meal or you can be the meal. So therefore it is much better to eat the meal than to be the meal. So you want to go to the table and you want to be able to eat at the table. It's that simple. And power is a game where you grab as much as you can. You eat at the table as much as you can. There are no rules about gluttony when it comes to power. This is what A. Philip Randolph, this is what he preached. And A. Philip Randolph was one of the important African American leaders who believed in pressure politics. This emerged during the time of Roosevelt and the New Deal. The idea of pressure politics, the idea that, okay, we want power, we want access to power African Americans are demanding, and if you don't give it to us, we're going to do something that's going to make you wish you had. Okay? So the first form that this took was a threat of a major march on Washington. A. Philip Randolph wanted to have the military integrated, this is back in 1940, and he wanted to have the hiring in the defense industry integrated, and he wanted to have African Americans be able to get more access to defense industry jobs. And Roosevelt was kind of dragging his feet about this. So he said, okay, if they won't do this, we're going to have this huge march on Washington. I'm going to take 10,000 black people to Washington. And the idea caught on. Lots of people liked this idea. It caught on in the black community. Black newspapers started talking about it. Then the number went up. We're going to have 25,000 black people go to Washington. Then the number kept going up. 50,000 black people are going to go to Washington and march if we don't get what we're asking for. We're going to put pressure on these white people, man, and we're going to have 50,000 black people go to Washington. Well, at this point, when numbers start getting up like that, Roosevelt started to 50,000 black people in a segregated city like Washington. This is 1940. Washington is like hugely segregated city. Wow. Oh, this is definitely not going to work. Because, man, I'm thinking about those those bonus marches the veterans had with Hoover and what happened there, and MacArthur going out there with tanks, running the veterans off in Washington, D.C. Whoa, man, you see what happened to Hoover? They didn't do him a hell of a lot of good. So, man, that's not going to work. That's really not going to work. So, I think we're going to sit down and talk about this and see if we can come to some kind of negotiation about this. That's pressure politics. Okay. What Randolph was trying to show was that this is how you gain something. People will not concede anything unless they feel as though they're threatened. This is protest politics. Black people now discover that they had leverage and they could practice something called protest politics. Now, of course, the question will arise eventually is, are there limits to protest politics? But of course, in the beginning, at the time of World War II and the beginning of the New Deal, African Americans are excited about the possibilities of protest politics and pressure politics. Okay, the Civil Rights Movement became, in effect, the height of protest politics. The Civil Rights Movement was this enormously well-organized, inspirational, very compelling movement, a true movement to change things for African Americans. And it was really protest politics done up as an art that you just couldn't imagine. I mean, it was one of the most beautifully orchestrated movements in the history of political movements in the United States. I mean, every American should be proud of the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, it's an enormous. Daniel Patrick Moynihan said in 1965 that the Civil Rights Movement was one of the great achievements of Black Americans. It was one of the great achievements of Americans. Everybody, I don't know, man, what race you are, you should feel proud of the Civil Rights Movement. It was an enormous achievement. It was an enormous achievement of protest politics. It really gave you protest politics as something that was intelligent, humane, nonviolent, and truly committed to a generous kind of social change. It wasn't just, we want stuff. I mean, every interest group in America wants stuff. I mean, that defines you as a group. We all want stuff. Here was somebody who was saying, we want to change America because what will happen with us will redound on you, and it will be something good for everyone. So it was an enormous kind of generous sort of politics in a lot of ways. So this was protest politics at its height when you got the Civil Rights Movement through its early days, let's say from 54 through at least 1965. That it was this really hopeful, and it was a tremendous amount of optimism in the movement. And believe me, not all political movements give you optimism. They give you a whole bunch of stuff, but not necessarily optimism. I mean, some of them do, but not all of them. And, the idea that, you had a political movement that gave you optimism is extremely important. So this moment was the moment when you have the American city having become what it's become, this kind of enormous cultural and political center for the United States, and this movement having reached a certain point is, I think, one of the great achievements, one of the great moments in American history. Now, then after this moment, though, here's what happens. The other thing that's happening is that protest politics is meeting liberal reform politics. The one thing that's interesting about what's happening in the American city after World War II is the rise of liberal reform politics. Cities are suddenly looking at themselves and saying, what we need to do is get rid of machine politics. What we need to do is get rid of corruption. So it's happening in a whole bunch of cities. Liberals are taking over the cities, and liberals are kicking out the old machines, and liberals are bringing in a new style of politics. They're bringing in a new style of accountability. We're getting rid of the old patronage systems and stuff like that. So as you're getting this rise with protest politics, with African Americans having perfected it with the civil rights movement, you're also getting at the same time in cities the rise of liberal reform politics. And they meet. And they're not necessarily the same thing. For a long time, people thought they were the same thing, but they're not. They're different things. And liberal reform politics wound up in some ways being something that clashed with African American interest. So you get the rise of liberal reform politics at this moment. So African Americans have the civil rights movement. They've discovered that protest politics can work in a certain way for them. They've discovered that they can even have a certain level of success with protest politics. Now, the question is, where do you go from this point? Where do you go from the point where you've reached and you've gotten the Civil Rights Act and you've gotten the voting rights? Where do you go at this point? How do you develop? Where do you go? What are you going to do now? You can't endlessly do protest politics. Supposedly, the point is where you want to go, and what you want to do is that you want to go into party politics. You want to actually, you've now opened the door, so now you can go into the regular political structure, and you can get your stuff through regular politics, the way everybody else is. You've now opened the door. You've now changed America in this way that you can get in. So now you're ready to go into regular politics. You're ready to now, I don't need to be this kind of protest group anymore. I can now go into regular politics. But now party politics in America have been changed because party politics in America have now are undergoing this kind of liberal reform movement. Now, you might have been thinking, I'm going to go, a lot of ordinary black people might have been thinking, I'm going to go into party politics now, and I'm going to get what the Irish got when they went into it. And I'm going to get what the Italians got when they went into it. I'm going to get into this, and I'm going to give a whole lot of stuff to my group, just like they did. I'm going to get into it just like they did. We're going to get mayors, and we're going to take over city council, and we're going to get the same stuff they got, because that's how they did it. That's the immigrant story, right? That's the immigrant. Your group winds up taking over City Hall, and you wind up giving all your stuff to your group. And so we're going to go in there, we're going to do the same thing, except liberal reform came in and said, you can't do that. We don't do that anymore. We're not running cities like that. You can't do that. So that's what I meant about the clash that happened in the 1960s between liberal reform politics in cities and the rise of African Americans being interested in party politics. As a result, they feeling that this is the next step after the civil rights movement, is to do party politics. And we're going to assimilate and do party politics, and we're going to succeed as a group with party politics. But the model they're looking at is, that's how the Irish did it, that's how the Italian Americans did it, that's how the white ethnics did it, and we're going to do it the same way, except they didn't wind up working the same way. And so one of the things you might be saying to yourself, as African Americans have often asked me, asked themselves, why is it that when African Americans got into politics and were able to get into politics in a big way, why didn't it work for them the way it worked for everybody? Why didn't, that should have been it. Okay, you go into politics, that should be it. But it didn't wind up doing that. Part of the reason is because of liberal reform movements that changed party politics in the United States so that it wasn't the same kind of patronage game that it used to be. Okay, so everybody still with me so far? Y'all still with me, huh? Boy, I can't believe it. Y'all just being nice. I know, y'all just being nice. Y'all very nice people. I need to take a little drink of water here. It's hard work being up here, I tell you, man. It is hard work. Man, after I do a class, I feel like I lost about 5 pounds after I taught a class, It's hard work. So I'll take a couple of questions here if you got questions on what I've said. Yes, sir. No, I don't have anything to say in this talk about the availability of bank credit, but that's an important thing. The availability of bank credit is a very important thing insofar as how residential segregation worked, and certainly how racial politics tended to work in cities. There was a lot of it had a lot to do with the availability of credit for various groups. But I don't have anything to say about that here in this talk because I didn't prepare anything along those lines. Did you want to add something about it? Right. That was about employment. That was in fact getting back to the story I was telling you about. Don't patronize a business where people who look like you don't work. So it was really less about credit. But the credit thing winds up having big ramifications for African Americans along the lines of home ownership. And as many of you know, home ownership is key to many people, many families developing any kind of real wealth, is to have home ownership. African Americans were always penalized insofar as being able to have home ownership. The other thing is, of course, being able to start small businesses. And African Americans, it was difficult for them to start small businesses in their neighborhoods for the very same reason. So what some African Americans decided to do, insofar as this problem with tight credit or impossible credit, was to try to start their own banks. And one of the people who was real interested in wanting to start, for having black people start a bank, is Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson was a real strong believer in black people having their own banks, and for a time worked at establishing a black bank that didn't quite work out. But that's a very interesting story about. But Jackie Robinson's whole post-career, when he was a liberal Republican, he was with that's another story. I can't get into all that, but it is interesting about the business of credit. And credit, how credit flows in the city has a lot to do with where people are and how they're situated. This credit is extremely important. Ma'am, did you have your hand up? Oh, you did. Oh, you had your hand up. Yes.
Any impact on the women's movement, on the black movement, civil rights movement?
I would say so, that there was an impact of the women's movement. Well, I would say it was probably on the whole positively, that it had an impact. But it was a little complicated. The story's a little complicated. The story is a little complicated because it goes a little bit like this, that African American men felt that they were being particularly put upon and oppressed, and their manhood was being taken away from them, that the whole system of racism and segregation took away African American manhood. So the whole business about the civil rights movement and African Americans getting their rights and fulfilling themselves all became part of this business about the restoration of the black male and black manhood and all this sort of stuff. I remember this when I was a kid. In the 60s, people were talking about the black man and all this. And at the same time, you see, the Moynihan Report came out in 65 and it talked about this black matriarchy. And that what the problem was with African Americans was that their households and their communities were dominated by single mothers. And that these single mothers distorted African American culture in this way. So the whole business of feminism and women's liberation, when it came out, had a positive impact, but had a different kind of impact because many black men thought that the movement was against them. In other words, the movement was going to hurt black people because the movement should really be about black men being able to have power to be able to be leaders, because they've been denied being able to be leaders, and they've been denied being able to be fathers, and they've been denied being able to have the male role and all that. And so they had that kind of, many black men had that kind of response to it. But it was very helpful on the whole to the African American community, and most black women responded to it very positively, because of there were obviously gender problems within the African American community. So that answer was a little too long. I got to shorten them up. Yes, ma'am. Yes. Right. Well, yeah, I mean, I understand what you're saying. Control has been an issue all along, because African Americans, of course, came here originally as an enforced labor population, and one of the things was to control that population, particularly because after Haiti, you said, oh, well, these people could rise up, and so we have to control this population. So yeah, control has always been on the mind of the dominant population of wanting to have control. The liberal reformers in urban politics after World War II were thinking that a little bit differently. They weren't necessarily thinking that it's a subtle way of control. What they were thinking about was that, you know something? We want to see black people have political power. That, in fact, will be the symbol of how we have reformed things when black people have political power. But they're going to have political power in a new regime, in a new way, because we're rethinking what political power should be. And so it was interesting that this clash should happen, and that you would have black people who actually wound up achieving political power and saying, it ain't what you guys used to have, And so, but I don't think it was necessarily the intent of the liberal reformist establishment that they were seeing it as a way of control. I think they were actually seeing it as a way of accommodating African Americans and giving them a voice. It's just that I think people had two different realities of the nature of the voice. I take one more question here, and yes, ma'am. No, I couldn't. I mean, the point is well taken, and it certainly is a fact, and it certainly is true. But I didn't prepare material for that today. But that certainly is absolutely right. They did not enjoy equally the benefits of the GI Bill. They did not enjoy equally the benefits of Social Security or most of the legislation that came out of the New Deal. And this is because this legislation was controlled by the states. I mean, the states administered this stuff the way they wanted to, and African Americans did not get the benefits from it that they should have. I mean, they got some benefit from it, but not nearly the benefit that they should have. That might have been a real difference maker in some instances. But I can't talk about it in any detail because I didn't prepare material on it. But thank you for asking. I mean, it's an important question. One more, yes, sir. Yeah, that's true. Is Tulsa the North? I wasn't sure if Tulsa was, is Oklahoma considered the North? I mean, I don't know. But in any case, you're right. Right, it's not rural. Right. And, the transformation of African Americans to urban life occurred where some African Americans moved in the South from rural areas to going into southern cities or cities like Oklahoma, like Tulsa or something like that. Now, the pogroms continued in some of these areas. There's no question about that. But there were pogroms in Chicago after World War I. I mean, there were nasty stuff happened to black people in a bunch of northern places. Now, black people had to deal with that, and as part of the condition of their living in the United States. But on the whole, they still felt that there were more things that were positive about living in the North than there was living in the South, in the rural South. Let me just give you materially example. Okay, black people had terrible housing in the North. I mean, they had poor housing, and it was racially segregated and so forth. But it was better housing than most of them had ever had in the South. One, in most instances, they had electricity when they came north. Many of them didn't have electricity when they were in the South. It's a big difference. Most of them didn't have indoor toilets when they were in the South. They came north and they had indoor toilets. Now, it might be that you had to be in an apartment building with, 10 other people on the same floor, but you did have an indoor toilet and you did have running water, and these were things that people didn't have in the South. And so despite the fact, polls that were taken of African Americans living in the North in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and asking them, okay, how do you feel about living in the North, or do you want to go back and live in the South again in the condition you were living? They all said, nah, I'd rather live in the North in this ghetto under these conditions than to go back into the South. Because they felt they were living, despite the fact that they were deprived conditions, they felt those conditions were more modern than the conditions they had in the South. That's one reason why the pogroms that happened in the North didn't drive black people out. In fact, it wound up driving them to going into protest politics to try to stop it, as opposed to driving them to go somewhere else. Yeah. Yeah, I guess so. Okay. So, we're all cool. We're all on the same page. We're all cool. I like to make sure, because I don't like to leave anybody behind. I believe no child left behind, man. So, I want to make sure everybody's with me. I want to make sure everybody's cool. We all with it. Y'all okay over here? Everybody cool? Okay, good. I want to make sure everybody knows, everybody knows what's going on, and everybody's cool. Okay. Okay. So, liberal reform and African American opposition. Okay. Liberal reform in the city. Let's start out with urban renewal. Urban renewal was a post-World War II liberal reformist program. It was meant to help cities. Urban renewal was about getting rid of blight, getting rid of bad neighborhoods. And after World War II, some cities went at it with real zeal to get rid of bad neighborhoods. So we're going to tear them down. Let's tear down bad neighborhoods. That sounds like a wonderful idea. Let's tear down bad neighborhoods. There's only one little small problem with this, is that people live in these neighborhoods. And you got to do something with these people who live in the neighborhood when you tear down the housing there. Remember that there has always been a housing problem in the United States. There's always been a housing shortage in the United States, and particularly for poor people, there's always been a shortage of affordable housing. That's always been a problem in the United States. And in the 30s, there were a group of people who called themselves housers who were trying to start the public housing movement and trying to get Roosevelt to really fund public housing in the United States because of the shortage of affordable housing in the United States. Now, after World War II, you have the Urban Renewal Project, and the whole reason for urban renewal was that you were going to get rid of these blighted areas. Now, if you got rid of the blighted areas, you got to put the people in the blighted areas somewhere. Now, when these things happened with African Americans, what happened was that the areas that remained where African Americans lived in a particular city became even more crowded because that's where they had to go. You couldn't go live with white people, so those areas became even more concentrated with black people when you had urban renewal happen and wiped out certain neighborhoods. Now, there were experiments people tried to do some kind of experiments to try to get people together. How long does this last? 12:30. Okay, fine. I needed to have my timing in my head straight. So I know if I should say, if I'm going to say too much about something, or something, sorry about that. So you had people, who tried to do experiments because there were people who were in the public housing movement, who wanted to create something called mixed housing. They wanted to create neighborhoods of mixed income housing. That was always the dream of these people who were the housers, was to create mixed income housing. Because this to them was the ideal neighborhood when you had mixed, the word, diverse, that word, neighborhoods of income. So there were experiments that were tried, for the small experiments that were tried. Some of them worked, some of them didn't, none of them were really sustained. What most cities wanted in liberal reform with the urban renewal was to get rid of an old poor neighborhood and put middle class people in there, or put some high rises in there, some business stuff in there. That's what they wanted to do with this. And the idea of what you're going to do with these poor people, they weren't really that concerned about that, or really didn't care that much about that. So urban renewal became this kind of odd sort of thing that happened, where you had liberals who were having this liberal reformist movement, who were doing things that actually were hurting poor people, or actually hurting African Americans in a lot of ways. Now, what people tried to do to balance urban renewal is create something called public housing. And public housing really took off after World War II, housing subsidized by the government, and the government actually getting into the business of building housing. This wound up, of course, creating something that many of you know called projects in cities, in big cities. Now, public urban renewal was a problem for African Americans, and so was public housing. Public housing was meant to try to solve a particular kind of problem that it was unable to solve. First of all, because not enough of it was built to really accommodate the needs of people who really required having public housing. But the other thing is that public housing wound up intensifying a problem instead of alleviating it. It wound up becoming part of the problem instead of part of the solution, because it wound up isolating poor people even more. When you built high-rise housing projects and all that, you actually wound up isolating poor people even more. And so it wound up actually becoming more of a problem with poor people in neighborhoods when you built public housing than it was before. So it actually here was this idea of liberal reform, because people went, look, I don't want to, people went into public housing. I mean, they went into it with good intentions. I guess it's true, the saying about the road to hell is paved with good intentions, because people went into it with good intentions. They weren't bad people. They weren't evil people. They weren't going into it thinking, oh, I hate black people, I hate poor people. They wanted to help poor people. They wanted to help black people. They were going to build this stuff because we're going to help them. And so they built stuff that didn't wind up helping people very much. It hurt them. And Ed Bacon and these other city planners were right, that essentially the only way you're going to deal with this problem, you've got to create mixed neighborhoods. It's the only way you're going to deal with this problem. You can't deal with it any other way. But this wound up becoming a major problem for African Americans in cities. It's dealing with housing. Housing is not only segregated housing, but lack of housing and lack of affordable housing become big issues. Okay. Job discrimination, and that also is a major issue in cities. That's why you had the Jefferson Bank sit-in here, for instance, is because of job discrimination. And it was felt that job discrimination was something that was systemic. It wasn't just, some particular person who didn't like it. It was part of a system. It was institutionalized. School integration. School integration was also another major issue for African Americans because African Americans after a point felt the only way they were going to get really well subsidized schools was that the schools had to be integrated. And of course, as you know, in the 60s and 70s, whites were often in the North as well as in the South not very open to school integration. Finally, civilian police boards. Because of African American concerns about policing in their neighborhoods, they were always very supportive of the idea of civilian police boards. This is to say, you had something that was going to, you had civilians control, the police had the answer to civilians. And people can make complaints about police brutality, problems with the police, blah, 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 blah. And the police, and there would be civilians, in the city, and you could take your case there, and the police would, deal, and the civilian board would review your case, and not the internal investigation department of the police department investigating the case. So, of course, the police never liked, civilian police boards. They never have. I mean, they've just never liked them. And they said, we don't want outsiders coming in judging how we should run things. Of course, the police, you want civilians to be involved with the police and have interaction with the police and work with the police. So, in any case, African Americans have always been in favor of civilian police boards because, of course, African Americans have never fully trusted the police. They said police can do bad things. Police, can beat you up. Police can kill you. Police can make up evidence. Have you ever wondered why Perry Mason was the most popular TV show among African Americans when it was on television? It's true. It's true. It was the most popular TV show. Every black person I knew looked at Perry Mason. And you know why? It was because every week the criminal justice system screwed up and arrested the wrong person and put the wrong person on trial. And black people say, I believe this. Of course this happens all the time. I totally believe this. So that's why that show was really popular. I am not making this up. This is true. This is why this show was really popular. Perry Mason was always correcting the police department every week because they were arresting the wrong person. The rise of the modern urban race riot. Okay. We now have arrived at this moment where we have the modern race riot. The things that are driving it, issues of police brutality, economic disadvantages, bad housing, inadequate housing, not enough housing, poor schools, crime in the neighborhoods. All these forces are driving what's going to become the new race riot. The new race riot, you can say, okay, maybe it had its origin as far back as 1943 in Harlem, but its real origin that most people date it is 1964. Year 1964, you have a race riot in Harlem and Bedford-Stuyvesant over a police officer shooting a young 15-year-old black boy who was on his way to summer school. And the boy attacked the police officer with a knife, and the police officer kills him. This new kind of riot included looting, fighting with the police, public demonstrations in the streets, and beating white people if they came into your neighborhood. This was something that was different than before. White people were in Harlem during the time of this riot. White people were in Bed-Stuy during the time of this riot. They got pulled out of their cars, beaten up. Police had to come and rescue them, and the like. So there was talk, and these riots produced talk about we want white cops out of our neighborhoods. We're tired of all this crap, so forth. This was a different kind of race riot than the kind of race riot you had before, where whites attacked blacks and went into black neighborhoods and attacked blacks. This is a different kind of race riot. It's a different kind of formulation that's coming out of a whole set of these particular issues, or these particular set of problems that black people are facing. Now, we know certain things about these kind of riots that have occurred all the way up until Ferguson. We know that they usually last a minimum of about 3 days and no more than a maximum of about 7 days. Okay? And we know that these will tend to exhaust themselves after a certain point and burn themselves out. Now, the reason why you wait a minute, that's the wrong thing here. The reason why I'll come to that in a minute. I was going to tell you the reason why I call them riots instead of unrest. I was going to come to that in a minute, but I'll come to that in a minute. Okay. Let's go to a historical moment. Okay, you have these riots that are beginning to happen in the 1960s. 1964, you have a riot in Harlem. You have a riot in Philadelphia in the same year. In 1965, you get the granddaddy of this type of race riot with Watts. No one thought that no one imagined that it could be as bad as Watts. Harlem and Philadelphia in 64 were not anything on the scale of Watts. Watts stunned people. The ferocity of it and the number of deaths connected with it, and the fierce hatred that black people showed to whites and to the system stunned people. And they were, it was like a race war. It was like for the several days that riot happened, it was like Los Angeles experienced a race war. Okay? So these things kept breaking out in various cities. Now, at this point, with the liberal white reformers and the civil rights movement kind of intersecting, you got the creation of the black mayor. And the creation of the black mayor happened in 1967. Well, there were 2 black mayors elected that year. One I'm going to talk about for a few minutes is Carl Stokes of Cleveland. Carl Stokes was really the transformation of black urban politics. This was it. This was the big moment. This was what the civil rights movement seemed like it had been tending toward. We now have a black man who's the mayor of a big, important, majority white city. At this time, Cleveland's black population was about 37%. So between 37 and 40%. So here's this big moment when Carl Stokes becomes mayor. He had come up with the type of political pedigree that you need for somebody to become mayor. He had become a lawyer. He had been a prosecutor. He had been in the army. He had the kind of connections with the black community that were important in helping him have his political rise. But he also had the respect of the white community, and so he was this kind of perfect sort of crossover figure. He was a kind of like Obama in a way, before you got Obama. He was the prototype for it, insofar as a black person being able to have crossover political appeal and have crossover political power. He got support from the white business community. He got complete support from the African American community. He got 95% of the black vote in Cleveland when he ran. He was successful at fundraising, and he was able to buy off black nationalists. He promised black nationalists, "Oh, we're going to give you stuff," and everything. And so, why did he win, and why did he have the support? It was because in 1966, Cleveland had a race riot. 4 people died in this race riot. It happened because in the black neighborhood of Cleveland called Huff, a white store owner who was angry put up a sign said, "No drinking water for niggers here." And as a result of putting up that sign, black teenagers got angry, attacked his store, and before you know it, you had a few days of looting and rioting and violence. Carl Stokes ran on a very simple slogan: "If you elect me, you won't have any more riots." And everybody bought that in Cleveland. They said, "Oh, okay, fine. This is what a black person can do for us if we elect a black person here, is that he can stop the riots." And it didn't work that way. In 1968, the year after he was elected, Cleveland had a bad race riot. Blacks voted for Stokes because they thought he could win. The election of a black mayor would be historic, in much the same way black people voted for Obama because it was historic. And Stokes would make black issues a priority. Black people were thinking, we're taking over City Hall now, and we're going to, we're going to work the political machine the way white people did. I don't have any problem with corruption. Corruption is cool as long as I'm getting my share of it. The problem with corruption before, I wasn't getting anything. But we're going to have corruption now that works for me. It's cool. That's fine with me. If we're going to have sweetheart deals, under the table deals, if I'm getting the money, then it's cool. I want to get what the white folks had, and so this is cool with me. So many black people were thinking that way. Okay. So let me see here. I'm gonna skip ahead here. Stokes accomplished some very interesting things when he first got into office. He did prevent a riot when Martin Luther King was assassinated in April. He got money from HUD for urban renewal, so forth. I'll talk about that in a second. But the Glenville riot of 1968 was a bad riot in Cleveland, and this was just a couple of months after Martin Luther King. It was basically some black militants in Cleveland who got so upset and they were so angry and decided they were just going to, be out and out revolutionaries, and they assassinated some white police officers. And, the riot was on. They killed, I think, 2 or 3 white police officers. And so the riot was on after that. The people who did this, they themselves were killed in this. So at any rate, Stokes didn't know how to stop it. The big problem, he was begging people, was pleading people. You remember that when Ferguson broke out, the black leadership went out, Charlie Dooley and other people, they went out and they talked, and the people didn't pay them any attention. This happens almost in every riot. The established black leadership will go out and say, stop this, don't do this, you're hurting yourself, you're hurting the community, and everything, and they don't get listened to. This is standard. They will not get listened to. People will just ignore them. People will tell them, go away, you're an Uncle Tom, blah, 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 I'm tired of you, da, 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 da. Clearly people are venting, because clearly many of these people are, in fact, when people aren't in this sort of inflamed mood, in fact, highly respected. I remember in Philadelphia when they rioted in 64, the head of the NAACP in Philadelphia was a guy named Cecil Moore. Man, he was one of the most militant, outspoken guys. I mean, he would get up in white people's faces. I mean, people loved him because he got up in white people's faces and just tell them, just read the riot act to them, and everything. And this riot broke out in Philadelphia, and he went around the streets telling people, stop it, cool it, don't do it. And somebody hit him in the head with a brick. This is a guy who was really respected by black people, and people thought he was really militant. Somebody hit him in the head with a brick. This is people who have decided that they don't want to be governed anymore. That's what a riot is. It's a spontaneous moment when a group of people decide to show that they don't want to be governed anymore. And that's what happened. We won't be governed anymore. And I don't want to hear what you have to say. I don't want to hear what anybody got to say. We have withdrawn our consent to be governed. We are now going to show the world we are ungovernable. That's what a riot is telling you. Now, I want to tell you briefly a story about this low-income housing project that Stokes had. Stokes was one of the biggest issues was low-income housing. Black people looked at Stokes and said, build us housing, and he got money from HUD to do this, and he faced an enormous problem. Where am I going to put it? And he said, I can't put it in a white neighborhood. That's impossible. It would really be race war if I put a low-income housing in a white neighborhood. So he said, I can't put it in a poor black neighborhood because what I'm trying to do is trying to lift up poor black people, so I don't want to put in a poor black neighborhood because that's just going to make it some more poor black housing. All I'm doing is making a poor black neighborhood bigger by putting housing there. So I'm going to put it in a middle class black neighborhood. How do you think folks responded to that? Black people in that neighborhood, many started sounding like Rush Limbaugh. They said, look, how can you do this? You're going to wreck our property values if you put these poor people in here. We have worked hard to get this house, and everything. And, unlike white people, we can only sell our house to other black people because this is a black neighborhood and white people ain't going to move in here. So, we got limited money that we can get out of our house. We have worked very hard, man. There was a mailman who said, man, I worked all my life walking my feet off to get this house, put everything I got into this house. I got this nice lawn, and you want to put some poor people in here? We must be crazy. You must be like totally nuts if you think we're going to sit down here and let you put these poor people in here. And they said stuff about poor people you wouldn't believe. And so Stokes said, I'm going to improve the neighborhood. If you let me put this here, I'm going to give you better schools. I'm going to give you better streets. I'm going to give you better sanitation. I'm going to make this a model neighborhood. I'm going to make this a model city. Let me do this, and I'm going to make this a model city. And they refused. And he lost. A black mayor dealing with black people could not get this done. That's an important story for you to know about the complexities of race and urban politics. That's a very important story. In any case, let me go up here to the end. Skip over some stuff and just go to the end because I want to give you time to ask some questions. I think these are things we need to think about. When you think about Ferguson or anything else, and you think about other kind of riots that have occurred, as I said, what is a riot? When a group of people spontaneously for a brief period of time refuse to be governed. That, to me, is a riot. Why do blacks periodically withdraw their consent to be governed? That's the question I think people ought to think about when they think about the riots. I mean, you can think about the damage, you can think about other kinds of things, but why would a group of people periodically feel the need to basically say, I refuse to be governed? And I think that's a question that you ought to think about very seriously, is why that happens. Why have responses to past riots not stopped them from happening again? All of us in St. Louis might learn something from the city of Cincinnati, which had terrible race riots back in 2001 over an incident that was very similar to what happened in Ferguson. It was in a neighborhood called Over the Rhine, which is a poor black neighborhood in Cincinnati. A white policeman shoots an unarmed black guy named Timothy Thomas. Timothy Thomas was a petty criminal. He hadn't done anything violent or anything particularly serious, but there were some warrants out on him and so forth. The cop shot him because the cop was scared because it was a bad neighborhood. Then the cop lied and said, "Oh, I thought he was going to reach for a gun because the kid, went down like this." The kid didn't have a gun. As a result of this, riots happened. Severe riots happened for several days in April of 2001 in Cincinnati. And the people kind of responded in the same sort of ways people are responding now. People say, "Oh, let's have dialogues. Let's have conversations. Let's have dialogues and conversations, and let's talk. Let's spend some money. Let's have some programs." They did this in Cincinnati. Now, I think it would be interesting for all of us to sit down and study and find out what happened. What happened when they did this in Cincinnati? They had the same kind of incident, the same kind of violence. They had the same kind of response. What happened? My sociology friend at the University of Cincinnati, I just talked to the other day, I asked him that question, African-American sociologist at the University of Cincinnati. What happened as a result of all of this? And he said, things are the same. Over the Rhine, that poor black neighborhood is still over the Rhine. A poor black neighborhood is still the same. Nothing really much on the surface has really changed. But you don't have to take his word for it. You can go study it yourself. Go talk to some people in Cincinnati. Find out for yourself what happened. But I think it might be instructive for us in St. Louis to maybe talk, especially a city that's also a Midwestern city, a city that's very much like us in many respects, to talk to people and say, what happened? What worked? What didn't work? What did y'all not do that maybe we should be doing? Or what did you do that maybe we shouldn't do? But I think it might be instructive. But the question is, why is it that the riots over this period, over 50 years now, why is it that periodically these terrible riots keep happening? What is the American city and what is its future? What is an American city really? And what do you see as its future? Where is it going? Does it have a future? Is the city itself the problem? Is the way cities are set up, is the patterns of segregation in the cities, or the institutions of the city, or are cities themselves making this the problem? Why is the city so different at night? Remember this about the riots. No matter how much disturbance may be happening during the day, during the time when people are having a riot, what everybody fears, what the mayor fears, what the police chief fears, what public safety director fears, what the black leadership fears, what everybody fears is what happens at night. That's what everybody feared about Ferguson. What disturbances were, what happens at night is what everybody really fears. And so I leave you with that to think about. Why is the city so different at night? So I'll take your questions now. I was going to say what they used to say in vaudeville. Don't applaud, just throw money.
I have a question for you.
Yes, sir.
About St. Louis. St. Louis did not have a riot, as many other cities did.
Right.
St. Louis has had a couple black mayors.
Right.
St. Louis has... Oh, okay. Question concerning St. Louis. Most of us have lived most of our life here, and most of us remember that there was no riot, and other cities did.
Mm-hmm.
Why didn't that happen? What was the consequence when St. Louis elected a couple of mayors? We've had black control of police force, I think. What benefit? What's kept us out of trouble until this happened?
That is a question that is difficult for me to answer because maybe you're framing it a little bit differently. Maybe you were always in trouble and you didn't know it until the riot broke out, and then you suddenly realized, oh, we're in trouble, I never knew it. And certainly some people that would be the answer from some people at any rate about that. I don't know. I mean, every city is different. I mean, the composition of the city, the way the politics works in the city, whether a city has a strong mayor or a weak mayor system, a lot of different things may factor into what happens, the nature of the black leadership of the city. There's a whole lot of different things that may factor into that as to why St. Louis didn't have a major race riot in the 60s, and it had one just recently. But so I really can't answer that. But the thing is, I just want you to take a kind of longer view of this and not think that, oh, this was just stuff that happened in the 60s and it's an anomaly now. It doesn't seem like it's actually that much of an anomaly now. I mean, you had terrible race riots. For those of you who may remember Liberty City in Miami, and there was a terrible race riot there in 2004. Horrible. I mean, they were pulling white people out of cars and killing them. I mean, it was fierce. It was people. They had a lot on their minds. I mean, doing stuff like that, people got a lot on their minds. And so there's a tendency to say, oh, it happened in the 60s, and then this stuff that's kind of happening now is sort of an anomaly. But I don't think so. I think it's something like what happened in the 60s and what's happening now with American cities is that not a lot has changed since the 60s about the condition of cities or what's happening in cities. And certainly not very much has changed about, if you feel that residential segregation and poverty are part of this or drivers of this, people will tell you very little has changed. I just recently read in the paper that the gap between white people and black people economically is the same as it was 50 years ago. It's the same thing. You know, it's so in that regard, you know, maybe St. Louis was just late coming to the dance, and maybe that's all it is. I think it was Mark Twain who said, "When the end of the world comes, I want to be in St. Louis because I know I'll get there 10 years later." Actually, he didn't say that about St. Louis. He actually said that about Cleveland. Yes. Yeah, well, I mean, Stokes tried to do the same thing. I mean, he tried to buy off what he thought were the agitators or the people who were going to cause problems. And he tried that too. He didn't buy off enough of them, clearly. But yeah, I mean, yeah, sure, people will do that. Yes. Well, at least at that moment. Yeah, sure. Sure. Of course, the question is, why is that not sustainable? I mean, why is it that happens and then things kind of revert back to what they were? But yes, I mean, that's an excellent point that you bring up, certainly. And but of course, you know, the other question is about sustainability of protest. If you're trying to get some kind of results from the protest, why are the results you're trying to get not sustainable, really? But thank you for that intervention, because we had neglected to mention that. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I think one thing you said earlier about mixed income housing is critical because that has to do with it affects schools and almost everything.
Yeah, you know, it's called, yeah, the only way people have figured out how to do mixed income housing is basically something called gentrification. And gentrification comes with a whole boatload of problems. But gentrification was originally envisioned by somebody like Ed Bacon, who was one of the great cities, along with Robert Moses. You know, Robert Moses was the big guy in New York, and then there was Ed Bacon, who was the big guy in my hometown, Philadelphia. You know, if you don't know him, you know his son, Kevin Bacon, the actor. And Ed Bacon was a strong believer in gentrification. He was a strong believer in preservation. He was a strong believer in gentrification because he said that's the only way you're going to get mixed income. You cannot get mixed income by taking poor people and putting them in middle-class neighborhoods. The only way you can get it is if you get middle-class people to come into poor neighborhoods and revitalize them. Of course, gentrification comes with, as I said, a host of problems, but Ed Bacon saw this as true reform. His vision of the future of the American city was that people would leave the suburbs and come back to the city. That was what he envisioned as the future of the American city, and that you were going to have all kinds of mixed income neighborhoods, and you would never have any more of this stratification in residential income stratification in neighborhoods. That his vision of the future of the American city was that it was going to be that. And you know, so far, you know, we haven't gotten there, but you know, the future ain't over yet. Yes.
Can you comment about education? A lot of studies have pointed out that the root cause to a lot of this kind of comes back to education, the lack of education, and then you read about the stigmatism that's given by many of the black communities to their peers about trying to get an education.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, you know, there are people who are experts on education. I'm not one of them. But at any rate, education is certainly an issue. And I certainly think that, but how it's an issue is complicated. And how it works for African Americans is complicated. What they want from their schools. For instance, African Americans are of divided mind. They have divided mind about the movement of privatizing public schools. There are some African Americans who think that's a wonderful idea. We want to liberate ourselves from public schools and the like. And there are other African Americans who hate the idea of the privatization of public schools. So schools have to bear a lot of burden insofar as, especially when they're dealing with poor neighborhoods. My sister has been a social worker in Philadelphia for 30 years. And she tells me these stories you just wouldn't believe about kids going to school. They got parents who got, in jail, parents who got drugs. They got all kinds of unbelievable problems. She says it's a feat the kid is going to school. Let alone that the kid's going. If the kid learns, that's a bonus. If the kid learns something, it's a feat that the kid's going to school. And so you're facing all kinds of problems. Many times the schools themselves, even with all the will in the world, really don't have the capacity to take this on. The problem that you face is not only just the school, but the problem that you face with poor neighborhoods is that institutions in poor neighborhoods are weak. Poor neighborhoods have insufficient institutions. They don't have enough of them, and the ones they have are typically weak because they're typically undercapitalized and so forth. And so, or they have kind of foreign institutions that are there, and not institutions that have grown up and come out of the soil of the community itself. So they have enough, and this societies like our own are governed by institutions. If you don't have strong institutions in your neighborhood, if you don't have strong institutions for your particular group, your group is going to suffer. So the schools are suffering because other institutions in poor neighborhoods are weak, and that's making schools weak, and they can't govern the way they want to. It's 12:32, friends, and I'm supposed to quit at 12:30. But I'm willing to go on a little bit longer if the host is, but I'm just telling y'all it's 12:32. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much.